Okay, the second half of the lecture for Learning Objective 3 and the Production Cost Report deals with the costs that are flowing through the next department. Okay, so we've talked about the puzzles and the assembly department and how to account for all their costs, and then we're moving them into the cutting department. So let me preface what you're seeing here by telling you that the topic of equivalent units of production is probably the most complicated topic that we're going to cover this semester. So don't panic on me, but so this is probably, like I said, the most complicated that we'll cover, but be sure that as we go through that you take the time that you need to understand what equivalent units are, how we calculate them, and how they're used to move costs from one department to the next. And it's really interesting and exciting when you finally get to the end and everything balances. Okay, in accounting it typically does. We know the total units, we know the total cost, we just have to account for those. And so it's nice when we finally finish the production cost report to see all of those costs coming together. So for those of you who may move into the accounting field, you will probably never ever make these calculations by hand. You're going to have a database or a system set up that is going to help you with this process. You simply need to know how the information gets from this process cost report into your financial statements. On the other hand, those of you who are not accounting majors, but at some point you may be a part of managing operations that use process costs, it would be very nice for you to be able to understand how these costs flow. If you're being held accountable for the things that are taking place in the cutting department, then you need to be able to say to your supervisor, hey, you're holding me accountable for those assembly costs that got transferred in when those are really not my responsibility in the cutting department. I can only improve efficiency in my department, not in those costs that you transferred in. So do you understand enough about the process that you can discuss, question, analyze documents that are being handed to you or being used to evaluate your performance in a particular organization? So, like I said, it is a very complicated topic, but it's very interesting to see it all come to fruition at the end and to see how somewhere in the long term this could be of use or could impact you some way in your future career. So let's move on into the cutting department. So once again, we've finished the assembly of the puzzles. We're going to move them to cutting where they are cut and boxed. That's all taking place here. And so your text tells us that we had 5,000 units in beginning work in process. So when we first started in assembly, we were starting fresh. But the cutting department tells you, hey, at the beginning of the period, we had some puzzles that were being cut, they just hadn't been boxed, or they are in the process and we haven't cut or boxed them. They're in process. We know that 40,000 were transferred in. Okay, so if we back up to the prior screens that we've seen, we know that we finished 40,000 in the assembly department and moved them into the cutting department. So we have 45,000 units that we need to account for, as we mentioned before. Out of those 45,000, your book tells us that we completed 38 and we still had 7 in ending working process at the end of the period. So now we need to figure out the equivalent units for 38,000 completed units. Okay, you should know this one by now after our last series of lectures. If they've been completed and transferred out, then they have 100% of their materials and they have 100% of their conversion cost. And so they are the equivalent of 38,000 completed units. So they have all of their material costs, they have all of their conversion costs if they are being completed and transferred out, so that means they're 100% complete. On the other hand, and we can see that 38,000 complete, all the costs that were transferred in, all the materials, all the conversion costs, they are complete. On the 7,000 that were still in work in process, okay, well, notice it says that there are 0 equivalent units when it comes to materials. If you look back at your text, it tells you that in the cutting department, the only materials that are added to this process is the box. Okay, the puzzle, the cardboard, the picture, all of the materials from the assembly department are here. All of those costs are here in the transferred in cost. So the only materials that were taking place in the cutting department are the boxes, and the boxes are not added until the end. So we haven't incurred, and what are we ultimately trying to figure out? What cost? We want to know what cost took place in the cutting department. Well, there were zero cost for these 7,000 units that were in work in process. They're not complete. They do not have any direct materials yet. So we have spent zero cost on 0 units basically for materials. On the other hand, it tells us that out of these 7,000 units that they had 30% of the material and labor that they were going to incur has already taken place. Okay? So 7,000 units that are 30% complete of material and overhead, labor and overhead, your conversion cost, are the equivalent of having 21,000 finished units, equivalent units. Once again, let me try to take you back here. I want to know the total cost associated with these 38,000 units. Well, they have all their material and all their labor and all their overhead. I want to know the cost associated with these 7,000 units. Well, out of those 7,000, we've got zero cost related to materials because the box hasn't been added yet. And we have the equivalent of 21,000 units. So I need to know what it cost me to complete, 2,100. I need to know what it cost me to complete 2,100 units in labor and overhead. Right? Let's take that one step further. Here are our costs. Your book tells us that we have $233,040 worth of cost that are flowing through the cutting department. Okay, and we can back that up. We know that 19,000 of those costs were in materials, and we know that $16,040 of those costs were in labor and overhead, and 198,000 are the costs that were transferred in. Remember, this came from the assembly department. We moved 176,000 over from the assembly department this period, and we had 22,000 tied up in beginning work in process. So puzzles that were in this process, in the cutting process already, but hadn't been completed. Okay, so we can account for our $233,040 by the costs that were transferred in, and your book tells you transferred in costs are always considered 100% complete. We are not going to add any more cost to transferred in to this category. We're going to add some materials and we're going to add some conversion costs, but we will not add any more transferred in cost after the beginning of the period. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, you can see, once again, we figured out the equivalent units for materials were 38,000. Only those that were completed had their materials. We figured out the equivalent of finished units and conversion cost, the 38,000 that were finished and the 2,100 that were left in work in process. 7,000 of those in work in process, 30% complete, is the equivalent of having 2,100 finished units. So I need these numbers to be able to determine cost per unit. So first we track units, then we track cost. Okay, so remember we had the 233,000 in cost. We knew which category each one of those were a part of, but we need to know out of that 233,000 how much is in work in process and how much is cost that was added during the period. Okay, well, we were able to track that. Now we need to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. I have total units, equivalent units of completed, the equivalent of completed units. I have total cost. Now I can calculate the cost per equivalent unit. So simply we pull our numbers down. 198,000 in the transferred in department divided by 45,000 equivalent units is 440. 19,000 in materials that were added to these 38,000 units that were completed gives me 50 cents per unit in materials. The the $16,040 that were spent on conversion cost, labor, and overhead are being spread out over 40,100 equivalent units for 40 cents per unit. So once again, we add, these are the costs that were transferred in. These were the cost per unit that this department has incurred for materials, and this is the cost that they have incurred for conversion. If we add all of those together, it comes up to $5.30 per equivalent unit. Remember, we can't simply take the $233,040 and divide by 45,000 units, because not all 45,000 units were complete. And those units that have been completed have incurred more cost than those that have not. So we have to figure out the equivalent cost per unit for cost transferred in, for direct materials, and conversion cost. Once we know those costs, I can determine how much gets transferred out. And in this particular example, these 38,000 puzzles that have been completed can now move to finished goods. I need to know the cost that need to move to finished goods for those 38,000. So again, if we know that we have completed 38,000 units at $4.40 a unit, then that is the cost that gets transferred to finished goods. 38,000 units finished in regards to material times 50 cents per unit for materials. This is the cost that gets transferred either to the next work in process account if we had one, the next process, or to finished goods if we're done. And in this example, we're finished. The puzzles are ready to be sold. Conversion cost 38,000 finished units times 40 cents a unit, and that is the cost that will get moved to finished goods. We add those up, okay, and let me see, add those up. So the 167.2 and the 19,000 plus the 15.2 equals $201,400. All right, so if I know, once again, that I have $233,040 to account for, and I know that this is going to the next process or finished goods, then what I have left is the $31,640 for ending work in process. Okay? Once again, I know this is a lot of information. Let me just back up to that screen. But we see it come to fruition. We see it coming to the end. All of these, so the 233,000 that we are moving, or let me say the $201,040 that we are moving to finished goods, includes the material, labor, and overhead that took place in the cutting department, and it includes the cost that were transferred in from another department. And so the cost will flow from one department to the next, where we will add the separate material, labor, and overhead for that process. And at the end of the period, in order to determine a per unit cost, then we simply take the total cost added in that department divided by the equivalent units of production to come up with a cost per equivalent unit. And those are the costs that we use to determine what gets transferred to the next department or what gets to stay in work in process.